She walked into the showroom not knowing that by tomorrow morning, every person who looked at her with contempt would be standing in absolute silence. The glass doors of Westbridge Luxury Motors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss as Emily Carter stepped inside, her simple white blouse and faded jeans immediately drawing subtle glances from polished sales associates who were used to greeting clients in designer suits and high-end watches. The showroom itself glowed under warm recessed lighting, reflecting off the glossy hoods of vehicles worth more than most homes in the state of Illinois. Emily paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere with calm curiosity rather than awe, her presence understated yet steady. At the front desk, Rebecca Hayes, the showroom sales manager, exchanged a quick look with a colleague before stepping forward with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you looking for something specific today?" she asked, her tone carefully measured but layered with doubt as her gaze briefly scanned Emily's casual outfit. "Yes," Emily replied softly, her voice calm and polite. "I'd like to see the Phantom series. The Rolls-Royce." A flicker of amusement passed across Rebecca's face before she masked it, gesturing toward the display floor. "Those vehicles are by appointment only and typically reserved for verified clients," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as if explaining something obvious. Around them, a few customers pretended not to listen while clearly observing the exchange. Emily nodded once, unbothered, and walked a few steps closer to the vehicle on display, her reflection faintly visible in the polished black paint. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Rebecca followed at a slight distance, arms crossed now, her patience visibly thinning. "It's also over $450,000, she added, emphasizing the number as if it carried a boundary Emily could not cross. A young salesman named Daniel Brooks, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, sensing something off about the situation but unsure how to intervene. Emily simply placed her hands lightly behind her back, studying the car with genuine appreciation. "I understand," she said. "I'm not here by mistake." The words lingered in the air longer than expected, but Rebecca only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that dismissed rather than acknowledged. "Of course," she replied, already turning slightly away as if the conversation had naturally concluded. "If you'd like, we can show you something more practical within your range." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took one last look at the vehicle before stepping back, her expression unreadable, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the quiet assumptions forming around her. And as she walked toward the exit, unnoticed by most, she gently adjusted a simple silver ring on her finger, as if marking a decision no one in that room could yet understand. Emily Carter stepped out of Westbridge Luxury Motors and into the cool afternoon air, the automatic doors closing behind her with a quiet finality that contrasted sharply with the atmosphere she had just left. Inside the showroom, the moment she disappeared from view, the subtle tension that had formed around her presence slowly dissolved into casual dismissals and quiet laughter. Rebecca Hayes exhaled slightly, smoothing her blazer as she returned to the front desk, already reframing the interaction in her mind as just another routine encounter with a curious visitor who did not belong in her world of high-value transactions. "People really think they can just walk in here and browse like it is a shopping mall," she said under her breath to Daniel Brooks, who stood nearby, still watching the entrance with a faint expression of uncertainty. Daniel did not respond immediately. Something about the way Emily had spoken, the calm certainty in her voice when she mentioned the Phantom series, lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have. Rebecca noticed his hesitation and gave a small, dismissive smile. "You are overthinking it. We see this type all the time. No appointment, no profile, no purchase history." Her tone was final, designed to close the subject, and gradually the showroom resumed its rhythm of polished interactions and carefully curated attention. Yet Daniel's gaze drifted back toward the glass doors where Emily had exited, remembering how she had not argued, not protested, not even flinched at the subtle humiliation directed at her. Outside, Emily walked along the sidewalk at a steady pace, her expression unchanged, as if nothing of significance had occurred. The city traffic moved around her in a steady hum, and she paused briefly at the corner before taking out her phone. The screen lit up softly in her hand, reflecting in her calm eyes. There was no urgency in her movement, only quiet intention. She scrolled once, then made a brief call, her voice low and controlled. "It is done," she said simply. There was a short pause on the other end. Then she added, "Have it ready for tomorrow morning. Front entrance." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, as if confirming a plan already set in motion long before she entered the showroom. Back inside Westbridge Luxury Motors, Rebecca was now reviewing the day's appointments, occasionally glancing toward the display floor where the Rolls-Royce Phantom sat under perfect lighting. A couple of potential buyers had arrived, and she immediately shifted into her professional tone, offering greetings and guided explanations with practiced ease. Daniel continued his work, but his focus remained slightly fragmented, as though part of him was still trying to reconcile Emily's quiet demeanor with the faint sense of importance he could not explain. As the afternoon progressed, the earlier interaction became nothing more than a passing anecdote for Rebecca, something she would likely mention later as an example of misplaced confidence from unqualified visitors. Yet beneath the polished surface of the showroom, an unspoken imbalance had already been set in motion, one that none of them could yet identify. And as evening approached, the glass facade of the dealership reflected the fading light of the city, quietly marking the end of a day that appeared ordinary to everyone inside, except for the woman who had left without saying anything more than she needed. The first sign that something was different came the next morning. When Westbridge Luxury Motors opened its glass doors 15 minutes earlier than usual, without any announcement, as if the building itself had been quietly instructed to prepare for something important that no one yet understood. Inside, Rebecca Hayes was already present, reviewing the day's schedule with a sense of routine confidence, until she noticed an unusual email flagged at the top of the internal system marked as priority client arrival. The message contained no name at first, only a confirmation code tied to a high-level corporate account and a request for full showroom readiness at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Rebecca frowned slightly, adjusting her screen brightness as she read it again, then called Daniel Brooks over with a subtle wave of her hand. "Do we have any scheduled VIP appointments today that I am not aware of?" she asked, her tone shifting into professional alertness. Daniel scanned the system and shook his head slowly. "Nothing listed. All I see are standard viewings and one test drive at noon." Rebecca's expression tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction that did not yet signal concern, but rather curiosity layered with mild irritation. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet residential area, Emily Carter stood in her kitchen pouring a cup of coffee as morning sunlight filtered through the window. There was no indication in her demeanor that anything significant was approaching, only a calm, structured routine that suggested she had long grown accustomed to mornings that carried more weight than they appeared to. Her phone rested on the counter, silent, until a brief notification appeared and disappeared just as quickly, as if confirming that everything she had arranged was already in motion. At exactly 8:45, a black corporate vehicle pulled up discreetly behind Westbridge Luxury Motors, followed by another vehicle with no visible branding, both remaining parked as if waiting for an unseen instruction. Rebecca noticed them through the glass and stepped closer to the window, her curiosity now turning into focused attention. "That is not normal delivery traffic," she said quietly. Daniel joined her side, watching as a man in a dark suit stepped out of the first vehicle and spoke briefly into a headset before standing still, scanning the entrance of the showroom with a composed, professional stillness that immediately drew attention from staff. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere subtly shifted as employees began adjusting their positions, straightening displays, and preparing for a client arrival that none of them had anticipated, but all of them now felt compelled to treat with heightened seriousness. Rebecca instructed the team to ensure the Rolls-Royce Phantom display area was immaculate, her voice now more precise and controlled, while Daniel found himself repeatedly glancing toward the entrance, remembering Emily's calm tone from the day before and the strange certainty in her words. At exactly 9 o'clock, the glass doors opened again, and the entire showroom seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, not because of noise or movement, but because of the quiet authority that entered with the morning air, shifting the tone of the space in a way that no one inside could immediately explain. The moment the glass doors of Westbridge Luxury Motors opened at exactly 9 o'clock, The atmosphere inside the showroom shifted in a way that no one could ignore, as if the space itself had acknowledged the arrival of something far beyond a typical customer interaction. Rebecca Hayes straightened her posture immediately, her professional instincts activating as she prepared to greet what she assumed was a high-value client tied to the unexpected priority notification from moments earlier. Daniel Brooks stood slightly behind her, his attention fixed on the entrance with a sense of unease that had been building since the previous day. The first figure to enter was a man in a dark tailored suit, moving with controlled precision, followed by another and then another, each maintaining a quiet, disciplined presence that made the usual showroom conversations fade into silence. Rebecca stepped forward with a practiced smile, but it faltered slightly as she noticed that none of them were looking at the cars. Instead, their attention remained fixed on the entrance, as if waiting for someone else. "Good morning. Welcome to Westbridge Luxury Motors," she said carefully, her voice now softer than usual, shaped by uncertainty rather than confidence. The lead man gave a brief nod but did not respond, instead lifting a subtle gesture toward the entrance. And then it happened. Emily Carter stepped through the doors again, but this time everything about her presence was different from the day before. She wore the same simplicity in her clothing, a clean white blouse and neutral trousers, yet the silence that followed her entry was immediate and absolute. Rebecca froze for a fraction of a second, her mind struggling to reconcile the woman she had dismissed the day before with the quiet authority that now filled the space around her. Daniel's breath caught as he recognized her instantly, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. Emily did not look around with hesitation or uncertainty. She walked forward at a steady pace, not toward the cars, but toward the center of the showroom where the Rolls-Royce Phantom stood under controlled lighting. The staff instinctively stepped aside, not because they were instructed to, but because something in her movement created an unspoken expectation of space. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice slightly strained as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Miss Carter, I was not aware you had an appointment this morning." Emily stopped briefly, turning her gaze toward Rebecca with calm composure. "I did not need one," she replied simply. The words were not loud, yet they carried a weight that settled across the room. Outside, the sound of a vehicle door closing drew attention, and through the glass walls, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom came into full view as it rolled to a smooth stop directly in front of the showroom entrance. The reflection of the vehicle stretched across the polished floor inside, drawing every eye toward it without a single announcement. Rebecca's expression shifted subtly as she turned toward the glass, her mind beginning to register the significance of what she was seeing. Daniel moved closer to the window, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with a dawning realization that left him visibly still. The rear door of the Rolls-Royce opened slowly, and a man stepped out with calm authority, adjusting his cuff with quiet precision before looking directly toward the entrance. Inside the showroom, the silence deepened as recognition spread across the faces of the staff one by one, and Rebecca Hayes, for the first time since working there, found herself unable to speak as the identity of the man outside became unmistakably clear. The moment the man stepped out of the Rolls-Royce Phantom, the entire atmosphere inside Westbridge Luxury Motors shifted into a silence so complete that even the subtle hum of the lighting seemed distant and unreal. Emily Carter stood still near the center of the showroom, her expression unchanged, as if she had already anticipated this exact moment. Rebecca Hayes, still frozen near the front desk, felt her professional composure beginning to collapse under the weight of recognition as her eyes locked onto the figure outside. Daniel Brooks was the first to whisper the realization without meaning to. "That is William Carter," he said quietly, almost as if confirming it to himself rather than informing anyone else. The name alone carried immediate weight, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was widely known across financial and automotive industries as the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Holdings, a global investment and luxury asset conglomerate. Outside, William Carter closed the door of the vehicle with calm precision and adjusted his suit jacket as he took a measured step forward. There was no rush in his movement, only controlled authority, the kind that did not need introduction or announcement. As he approached the glass entrance, the staff inside instinctively straightened, unsure whether to move or remain still. Rebecca's lips parted slightly as she tried to process the situation, her earlier confidence dissolving into disbelief. Emily turned her head slightly toward the entrance, and for the first time since she had arrived, a faint shift in her expression appeared, not of surprise, but of acknowledgement. The doors opened automatically as William entered, and the subtle sound of his footsteps on the polished floor seemed disproportionately loud in the silence that followed. He did not look at the cars, nor at the staff. His eyes immediately found Emily. "Good morning," he said calmly, his voice steady and controlled, carrying a quiet familiarity that made the entire room feel smaller. Emily responded with a slight nod. "Good morning," she replied simply. There was no emotional display, no dramatic reunion, only an ease between them that suggested this moment was not unexpected. Rebecca stepped forward slowly, her voice now noticeably less certain than before. "Sir, I believe there may be some misunderstanding," she began, attempting to regain a sense of procedural control. William turned his attention toward her for the first time, and the shift in his focus alone was enough to interrupt her sentence. "There is no misunderstanding," he said evenly. The words were not raised, but they carried a finality that settled over the space. Daniel looked down briefly, realizing now that every assumption made the previous day had been fundamentally incorrect. Emily had not been a random visitor. She had not been an unqualified observer. She had been the quiet center of a reality no one in the showroom had taken the time to see. William took one step closer to Emily and then glanced around the showroom, his expression neutral but observant. "This location is part of the Carter Holdings automotive division," he said calmly, addressing no one in particular but ensuring everyone heard. The statement landed heavily, reframing everything about the environment they stood in. Rebecca's breath tightened slightly as she understood the implication of his words, her earlier dismissal of Emily now echoing back in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. Emily remained composed, her hands relaxed at her sides, while William's presence naturally drew attention without effort or demand. The showroom, once filled with quiet commercial routine, now felt suspended in a state of recognition and consequence, as every individual inside began to understand that what they had witnessed the day before was not an ordinary interaction, but the beginning of a reversal they had not been prepared to see unfold. The silence inside Westbridge Luxury Motors deepened further as William Carter remained standing near the entrance, his presence stabilizing the entire space in a way that made even the most confident employees uncertain of their next movement. Emily Carter stood a few steps away from him, her posture unchanged, calm and composed, as if the unfolding situation was simply a continuation of something already known to her. Rebecca Hayes, who had moments ago carried herself with full professional certainty, now found her thoughts fragmented as she tried to reconcile the hierarchy of authority that had just been revealed in front of her. Daniel Brooks remained near the side of the showroom floor, his gaze alternating between Emily and William, slowly understanding that the quiet woman he had observed the previous day was not an incidental visitor, but someone whose presence extended far beyond what the showroom had ever prepared itself to handle. William took a slow step forward, not toward the staff, but toward Emily, as if the rest of the room no longer required acknowledgement. "Everything is in place," he said calmly, his voice steady and unhurried. Emily gave a slight nod, her expression reflecting quiet confirmation rather than surprise. Rebecca finally gathered enough composure to speak again, though her voice lacked its earlier firmness. "Sir, if there was any inconvenience yesterday, we were not aware of the full context of the situation," she said carefully, choosing her words as if trying to reconstruct a bridge that had already been broken. William turned his attention toward her, his expression unchanged but noticeably firm. "Context is not something that changes based on appearance," he replied evenly. The words were not aggressive, yet they carried a weight that made Rebecca instinctively lower her gaze. Emily remained still, her focus steady, while William continued. "This showroom operates under Carter Holdings oversight," he said, gesturing slightly toward the space around them. "Every interaction here reflects the values of the organization." Daniel shifted slightly, realizing that what had once been a standard luxury retail environment was now being framed under a far more significant structure of ownership and accountability. Rebecca swallowed, her hands clasped together in front of her as she processed the implication. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "I came here yesterday without expectation," she said simply. "What I received was enough to understand everything I needed to know." The statement carried no accusation, only observation, yet it caused Rebecca's expression to tighten as the memory of her own dismissive tone returned with uncomfortable clarity. William glanced briefly at Emily before turning his attention back to the showroom staff. "This is not about a single interaction," he said. "It is about how people are treated when they are assumed to have no value." The room remained still, the weight of his words settling into every corner of the space. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, visibly reflecting on his own hesitation from the day before. Rebecca stood motionless, no longer attempting to defend or explain, as the realization grew that her judgment had extended beyond a simple misunderstanding and into something far more consequential in its impact. Emily's presence remained unchanged, neither elevated nor diminished by the attention around her, reinforcing a sense of balance that contrasted sharply with the tension filling the showroom. William took a final glance across the space, then spoke one last time in a calm, definitive tone. "From this point forward, every client who enters here will be treated with the same standard of respect, regardless of assumption." No one responded immediately. There was no need for further clarification, only the quiet understanding that the moment had already passed from observation into consequence, leaving behind a silence that carried more meaning than any additional words could replace. The atmosphere inside Westbridge Luxury Motors remained suspended in a controlled silence, as if the entire building had recalibrated its understanding of what it meant to serve its clients. After William Carter's final statement, no one moved immediately, not because they were instructed to stay still, but because any instinctive action now felt secondary to the weight of what had just been acknowledged. Rebecca Hayes stood near the customer service desk, her posture rigid, her professional identity momentarily stripped of its usual confidence. Daniel Brooks remained slightly behind the main floor line, his attention no longer divided but fully focused on the quiet exchange unfolding between Emily and William Carter. Emily herself had not shifted from her calm stance, her presence steady, unaffected by the change in attention around her, as though the outcome of the moment had already been settled long before anyone else arrived. William turned slightly toward her, his tone softening compared to his earlier corporate address. "We will finalize the internal review today," he said, not as a warning, but as a confirmation of procedure already in motion. Emily gave a small nod, her expression composed. "That is not necessary for me," she replied quietly. "What matters already happened yesterday." The simplicity of her words caused a brief silence to settle again, not heavy with tension this time, but with reflection. Rebecca lowered her gaze for a moment, her earlier dismissal of Emily now replaying in sharper detail, each phrase she had spoken at the time returning with a different weight. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, his expression thoughtful, as if reevaluating every assumption he had formed in the previous day's brief encounter. William took a slow step forward, positioning himself beside Emily rather than in front of her, signaling a subtle shift from authority to alignment. "Still," he said calmly, "standards exist for a reason. Not just for transactions, but for people." His gaze moved across the showroom, briefly meeting the eyes of the staff who now stood in quiet awareness of their changed perspective. Rebecca finally spoke again, her voice more measured than before. "We understand," she said carefully, "and we will ensure that every interaction moving forward reflects that standard." There was no attempt to justify or minimize her previous behavior, only an acknowledgement shaped by the realization of consequence. Emily turned slightly toward the display floor where the Rolls-Royce Phantom remained positioned under soft lighting, unchanged in appearance, but now carrying a different symbolic weight than it had the day before. "I did not come here for correction," she said calmly. "I came because I appreciated the vehicle. Everything after that was interpretation." William followed her gaze toward the car, then nodded slightly, understanding the distinction she was making. Daniel, still observing, began to see the situation not as a reversal of fortune, but as a quiet exposure of how quickly perception could become judgment in environments built around appearance and status. Rebecca remained still, her hands now resting at her sides rather than folded, as if her professional posture itself had adjusted to something more grounded. William spoke once more, his tone steady but final. "This location will continue to operate," he said, "but the standard of engagement will be reviewed personally." The statement was not dramatic, but it carried the weight of structural accountability. Emily gave a final slight nod, then stepped half a pace back, signaling that her role in the moment was complete. The showroom, once filled with polished certainty and routine assumptions, now existed in a quieter state of awareness, where every individual present understood that what had occurred was not an interruption to business, but a correction in understanding that would remain long after the day ended. The morning light inside Westbridge Luxury Motors had shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the polished marble floor as the events of the day continued to settle into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. Emily Carter stood near the central display area for a moment longer, her presence calm and composed, as if confirming internally that everything she intended had already been understood. William Carter remained beside her, not in a protective stance, but in a quiet alignment that reflected mutual understanding rather than necessity. Around them, the showroom staff maintained respectful distance, their movements slower and more deliberate than before, as if every action now carried additional awareness. Rebecca Hayes remained near the service counter, her earlier confidence replaced with a steady professionalism that had been reshaped by recent events. She reviewed a tablet in her hands, though her focus occasionally drifted toward Emily and William, still processing the structural shift that had unfolded in less than 24 hours. Daniel Brooks approached slightly closer to Rebecca, speaking in a lowered tone. "I think we misread the situation yesterday," he said carefully, not as an excuse, but as an observation formed from reflection. Rebecca did not respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the showroom floor. "It was not about misreading," she replied after a pause. "It was about assuming without understanding." Her voice carried no defensiveness, only recognition of responsibility. Emily turned slightly toward the sound of their conversation, but did not intervene. Her expression remained calm, detached from the need for validation or correction. William stepped forward once more, glancing across the showroom with a measured look that suggested final review rather than confrontation. "This environment will continue to serve high-value clients," he said evenly. "But the definition of value must extend beyond appearance or expectation." The statement settled into the room without resistance, as if it aligned naturally with something that should have existed all along. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing the meaning without needing clarification. Rebecca closed the tablet gently and placed it on the counter, her posture now fully composed. "We will adjust training protocols accordingly," she said simply. There was no hesitation in her voice, only acknowledgement that structural change was already required. Emily took a slow step back from the display area, her attention briefly returning to the Rolls-Royce Phantom, which remained under controlled lighting, unchanged in physical form, but now carrying an entirely different symbolic significance within the space. William followed her gaze for a moment before speaking in a quieter tone. "Do you want anything further from this location?" he asked her directly. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "Everything I needed was already revealed yesterday." Her words were not emotional, but factual, as if the experience itself had already reached its conclusion. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Daniel looked toward the entrance of the showroom, then back at the staff, realizing that the day had shifted from routine operation into something more lasting in its impact. Rebecca remained still, her focus now internal rather than procedural, as she considered how quickly perception could shape decisions without awareness. William gave a final subtle nod, acknowledging the end of the moment rather than directing it. Emily turned slightly toward him, and together they began to move toward the entrance, their pace unhurried and consistent. The staff stepped aside instinctively as they passed, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. The glass doors opened smoothly as they approached, and the natural light from outside filled the showroom once more, blending with the controlled interior lighting in a quiet transition that marked the closing of a chapter no one inside would forget. As the glass doors of Westbridge Luxury Motors closed behind Emily Carter and William Carter, the showroom remained in a state of quiet suspension, as if unsure whether to return to normal operations or continue processing the significance of what had just taken place. Outside, the morning light reflected softly off the surface of the black Rolls-Royce Phantom as it prepared to depart, its presence no longer just a display of luxury, but a silent marker of authority and understanding. Inside, Rebecca Hayes stood motionless for several seconds after they left, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter as she stared at the space where Emily had stood earlier. The confidence that had once defined her professional demeanor had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped into something more reflective, something that required thought before speech. Daniel Brooks broke the silence first, exhaling slowly as he looked across the showroom floor. "I have never misjudged a situation that completely before," he admitted quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Rebecca did not respond immediately, but after a moment she nodded slightly. "It was not about one situation," she said. "It was about a pattern of assumptions we did not question." Her voice was calm now, stripped of the earlier certainty that had guided her judgment. Around them, the other staff members gradually returned to their stations, but the energy of the space had fundamentally changed. Conversations were softer, movements more deliberate, and every interaction seemed filtered through a new awareness of perspective and responsibility. Near the front of the showroom, a junior associate quietly adjusted the display lighting over the Rolls-Royce Phantom, then paused, looking at it not as a product, but as a reminder of how perception could shift within a single moment. Daniel walked slowly toward the entrance and looked outside, where the Rolls-Royce had already begun to move away from the curb. The vehicle did not accelerate quickly. Instead, it glided forward with steady precision, blending into the city traffic as if it had never been out of place. He watched until it disappeared from view, then turned back inside. Rebecca had returned to reviewing internal notes, but her focus was no longer procedural. It was interpretive, as if she were rewriting the meaning of every client interaction she had ever overseen. After a long pause, she spoke again, her tone measured. "We will need to revise how we define client engagement entirely," she said. Daniel nodded in agreement. "Not just define it," he replied. "We need to listen before we decide." The statement lingered between them, not as instruction, but as realization. In the background, the showroom resumed its quiet rhythm, but without the previous certainty of hierarchy based solely on appearance or assumption. Every staff member moved with a slightly greater awareness of context, of tone, of the unseen weight behind simple interactions. Hours later, as the afternoon light stretched across the polished floor, Rebecca stood alone for a moment near the central aisle. She looked once more at the space where Emily Carter had stood the day before, and then at the entrance where she had returned without announcement or expectation. There was no dramatic conclusion, no visible consequence beyond what had already shifted internally. Instead, there was a quiet understanding settling into place, one that did not require acknowledgement to remain permanent. And as the day continued, Westbridge Luxury Motors carried forward with the same structure it had always had, but with a fundamentally different awareness beneath it, where judgment was no longer immediate and respect was no longer conditional, leaving only the lingering silence of lessons that could not be unseen.